Hey y'all, it's Justin with the Appalachian Convergence Lab, AppCoLab. Welcome to episode 4. Episode 4 has me and Ali and Gina Giorgio. This is the first episode that we've done co-hosted. We have known Gina for a long time and we're honored to have her on. Gina is the founder of Carolinas for Care, an organization reimagining healthcare in North and South Carolina. Their mission is to improve health outcomes by advancing psychedelic therapies through education, research, community building, and policy reform. Carolinas for Care is committed to integrating those treatments into healthcare systems in a way that's safe, accessible, and patient-centered. Gina earned her master's in communication from Wake Forest University on a full academic scholarship, where her research examined how media portrayals of psychedelics shape public perception and policy development. So in this episode, we're talking about so much. We're talking about the Trump executive order. We're talking about what's going on in North Carolina. Without further ado, here we go.
I am listening.
Here we have Gina Giorgio, myself, Justin Moore, and Ali McGee. And today we're talking about a lot of things we have on our minds. The executive order, Bicycle Day, Carolina Cares, North Carolina, psychedelic bills. A lot's moving, a lot's happening, and this is our opportunity to chat with these three lovely folks and get some feedback from the community after that. So who wants to start us off with what is the executive order? What happened? Where are we now?
Was the timing intentional, or did it just
Was
happen to work out that way?
Yes. So
Okay.
Joe Rogan sends a text to the president, and 10 days later, we have the president using the word psychedelic. I've heard that that's maybe the first time a president has used it in a public setting. I know that Kennedy had said it before. He had meetings around LSD, actually. I just saw Jules Evans did a whole piece on that worth reading at some point. But nonetheless, there was, to me, there was this public signal that happened. The president said it in a way that wasn't, 1970s drug war announcement saying, hey, all drugs are bad. Let's start the war on drugs. Let's spend millions and if not billions of dollars over the next 50 years on a failed drug war. It was something different. What's the something different?
It's a good point. And I mean, from my perspective, in terms of presidents who have or have not mentioned psychedelics, President Trump is probably not the one that I would have said he's the one that would have been in favor of something like this. And so we've seen an interesting theme, even just this year, of him being more supportive of drug policy in general. So the psychedelic executive order rescheduling medical cannabis to Schedule 3, and then even a couple weeks ago in the Oval Office, he was talking about how we should be looking into natural 7-OH, which is the active metabolite of kratom. And
Hmm.
even that, there's been so much sensationalized media around. And I mean, and even just from what he's expressed personally in the past, that his brother dealt with alcohol addiction and that President Trump would, not touch something like alcohol. So then to completely change his stance on some of these substances that have been in Schedule 1, that in itself to me is an interesting phenomenon that it's psychedelics, but we're also seeing this theme of him being supportive of other drugs in general, especially for their therapeutic potential.
And it is interesting because in the executive order, he talks about progress helping those struggling with insidious mental illnesses and speaks about a decrease in suicide rates as well, which is interesting. So taking some credit for the mental health landscape overall there. So it seems like a related move.
Yeah, the system's been stalled for too long. Really, it's speaking and thinking a lot about this lately. It's really a human tragedy that clinical trials have been stalled and ineffective and failed in some cases. for medicines that have already proven their efficacy to a certain degree, and that those medicines have not made it to people. I worked in an inpatient setting for over 2 years and saw all kinds of medicines reach people. I even saw that particular high-profile hospital system consider ketamine for an inpatient crisis stabilization unit. And I've spoken with the physicians, the psychiatrists, the doctors there who would consider these medicines. But without some laws and structure around it to get those things through the system, they've not reached them yet, have committed suicide. People have missed these opportunities for things that could have worked for them. And that's really an emotional driver.
That is, and it is also a conundrum that at the same time that this funding is being allocated to psychedelic drug research, also funding has been cut, we've seen in so many areas for other medical research as well. And I know also I just want to talk about the amount, and maybe Gina, get your perspective on the amount of this funding, right? Is it anything more than a drop in the ocean in terms of what is needed? Is it it didn't seem like a huge amount of money, and I'm actually trying to find the statistic right now. 50 million.
50 million.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's like not a lot. Is it more that is that actually going to do anything? Well, and you've seen a lot happening on the state level. And what does that look like?
Both of you bring up a good point. And I think something that we hear, at least with opposition, people are saying, why are we prioritizing these medicines that have not yet received FDA approval? But to both of your point, I would say why we're seeing this is that because people are continuing to commit suicide, or they're struggling with their mental health for decades, and they're also leaving the country to get treatment elsewhere. And so the need has just become so great, and people are seeing the potential. I mean, and we're talking about more than also PTSD and depression, but anxiety, chronic pain, autism, potentially Alzheimer's treatment. There's so much applications that we don't even yet, I don't know if we've scratched the surface of some of the research potential here. And that's why one of the biggest parts that's interesting to me is this $50 million in federal funding, because we've not had hardly any federal funding for psychedelic clinical trials over the past few decades. It's been so difficult. I mean, even in the early 2000s, Johns Hopkins was having to get private money just to start psychedelic research back up. So part of that with this $50 million, which would go through ARPA-H, which is a federal agency within the Department of Health and Human Services. They've actually already outlined a few research institutions that would conduct psychedelic clinical trials. And so far there was psilocybin, which is, they outlined Johns Hopkins, University of Southern California, and University of Wisconsin-Madison. I don't think they specified how much each institution is getting, but that's what everyone is interested is like, how do we get this funding? How much is it? And that's actually, I think, one of the biggest hurdles is that we will likely need more than $50 million. And that is something that will need likely Congress to pass additional legislation for us to get more funding. But something that could help supplement that is this potential aspect of states matching the funding that the federal government provides. And that was something that was loosely outlined within the executive order, is that states for existing or future projects could match the funds coming from the federal government.
Yeah, and something I had learned recently was that Matt Zorn was the person that wrote the executive order. And so, knowing that he was in there, and for folks that don't know, Gina, you might know a little bit more than me than his history, but Matt Zorn, as a lawyer who's fought for these substances in different ways. I know he fought for DOI and DOC, I believe, and other substances. So he knew this world really well, and then got a position in the HHS and was in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, I was at a federal psychedelic summit in DC 2 weeks ago, and Matt Zorn actually spoke. So I think he's sued the federal government at least a couple of times and now actually works for them, which I think is a testament to his knowledge and skill, honestly. And I don't know him personally, but I can only imagine that he seems to be incredibly effective. There was a lot that he couldn't really speak on specifically, and I think that there's just so much that is still up in the air. So at the federal summit, people from ARPA-H were also speaking. And the main thing that I actually got, that my takeaway from that was that they're hiring for their Evident program. I think this is a really an all hands on deck situation that we're facing right now. I had heard that also, that, yeah, that there was this coordination between Joe Rogan, Brian Hubbard, and Matt Zorn when it came to the executive order, and it sounded like it all happened really quickly. And so, we actually saw Brian Hubbard in Asheville, North Carolina, the day after the executive order was signed, and he was giving us a little intel on what that process was, and it seemed like it was in the span of a couple weeks that that all really came together following his appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast.
Do you think that the president knew it was Bicycle Day weekend? Do you think he had an idea?
I'm sure it was, yeah, part of a grand they knew that we were all going to be together and that we could just celebrate it even more.
And just in case folks listening don't know what Bicycle Day is, Bicycle Day was the day that Albert Hoffman, I believe it was 1943, supposedly accidentally got some LSD on his finger, which then turned into the world's first LSD experience on a bicycle ride home, where he had a whole experience. And then, the culture has lovingly now called that Bicycle Day as a way to celebrate and explore and talk about psychedelics as a whole, but also LSD.
I think it was intentional, right? The first time, on a few days before, he accidentally took some, and then he took a whole bunch intentionally a couple days later, but same weekend.
I talked with David Nichols briefly, and he shared in his speech too that it's not as clear as I think some publications have made it out. David,
sure.
Even in his speech at Bicycle Day, mentioned like the amount that he took and the experience that he had do not match up. That it was potentially more of a spontaneous mystical experience for Albert Hoffman, which he had earlier in life. So maybe it was like a microdose or something that turned into a larger experience, because I believe the reports are that it only lasted like 2 to 4 hours. And if you've ever taken LSD, you know that it lasts a lot longer than 2 to 4 hours.
It's been a while since I've read this, but I think he journaled. Albert Hoffman has like a journal about his experience. So I encourage people to read that. And I think, it was like his lab assistant had to bring him home because he started to feel weird. And if I'm remembering correctly, he was in his home and he felt like his couch was trying to eat him. And I think he had to call his neighbors. And it was this kind of like terrifying experience of not really knowing what's going on, but that he woke up the next day without a hangover and feeling remarkably good.
Yeah.
And so that I think sparked a lot of the interest. And what is
Right.
I think he had drank milk or something at one point.
Yeah, that was it. A neighbor showed up with milk and he thought she was a witch.
Yeah.
Or something. Which, if a random neighbor shows up with milk, maybe I'd also think they were a witch. I don't know, but it seemed like they were trying to help, though.
Yeah. I do know he did have kind of what we might call that classic like clarity of vision after a psychedelic experience, where the world felt a little brighter to him. He felt a little lighter. And, even walking in his garden, he felt more connected to it, which is an interesting part of that whole story as well. I also want to bring it back there. So I had the distinct honor and challenge of moderating a panel the day after the executive order with Brian Hubbard and Gina, as well as Zane Bader and Michael Mithofer, both associated with MAPS. And, we start the panel off by having Brian share with the crowd his experience, and that will be that recording will actually be up soon through the Pearl Institute if folks want to check out that. But this was a unique timing for us all. Back to the Bicycle Day weekend, I don't think the president fully knew that the entire ecosystem across the world was gathering that weekend. Not necessarily for him, although maybe he would think that. But it gave us, all of us who have been in what we might call the psychedelic ecosystem for a long time, or who have put a lot of thought and effort into shaping it and learning and reflecting on it, had this experience of feeling a little bit taken back, a little bit excited, a little bit concerned, a little bit cautious. I think it came up for all of us, no matter how you felt about it. There was a celebration, but then there was also the fact that there was a lot of momentum before that built up to making it possible, but essentially the president and the folks behind it had about 10 days to plan the wording, the execution, the delivery, and the plan. And that's created a little bit of a backlash, a little bit of a like, okay, let's get this together. This is a good signal. How are we getting this together? What news have y'all seen, or what kind of action is there around the practicalities of implementing the impact of what the executive order was?
I've seen a few things happen since the executive order was signed, and it's been about 5 weeks since that happened. One was the ARPA-H funds that I mentioned. They outlined, I mean, not just psychedelic research, but other types of behavioral health innovations as well. And then now former FDA commissioner designated 3 national priority vouchers. I think that's two psilocybin compounds, 1 MDMA analog, to essentially help speed up review of the investigational new drug application. Part of, maybe the concern is that people feel like, oh, this is going to cut corners and speed up clinical trials, where I think one of the main things that this executive order is trying to do is to cut down the window of approval time. So it could take a year for someone to review your new drug application to the FDA, and this could shorten that from 10 to 12 months to potentially just a 1 to 2 month review period. Aside from that, I saw yesterday that the VA just announced a new clinical trial with veterans, and that is looking at MDMA for PTSD and alcohol use disorder. And that was one of the most recent updates I had seen. I mean, this could also be executive order related, but I saw that the American Psychiatric Association also had their annual meeting in San Francisco last week. And one of the NIDA directors talked about how she was pretty anti-psychedelic for a lot of her career and is now actually enthusiastic about a lot of the potential.
That's
Yeah,
interesting. And
go
yeah,
ahead.
I'm wondering too about, because the last big news we had at the federal level was the denial of MDMA assisted therapy, right? So are you seeing, kind of from your vantage point, this larger shift in attitudes toward it from, like you were just speaking about? Is it bringing kind of a sea change, or some of the questions still remaining that were there for the MDMA trial?
I am seeing more just eyes on the topic. So I think we're seeing people's minds change. I am still seeing skepticism, particularly around one, the MDMA application that wasn't approved, and some of the issues around the clinical trials there. So people being concerned about, psychedelics potentially increasing susceptibility of patients. But also, I mean, there's now, whether we like it or not, more of just a politicalization of psychedelics. And some people feel like, maybe a certain political party is adopting this more than the other, and they're concerned about that element. One concern that I heard even just last week is that people don't want another big pharma adoption of this treatment. And that's probably one of the main concerns that I'm seeing.
Yeah, I mean, all legitimate concerns. There's so many vantage points when it comes to these medicine, and then even more if you zero in on a specific substance. If we start talking about ayahuasca, the conversation shifts entirely. If we're talking about methadone or something, right? The conversations are different but related. One thing that I mentioned in the panel, and I think somebody else mentioned in the panel, is there is a social shift happening, and in my personal life, it was that after the executive order, just a conversation with my dad was like, I get a little bit more about what you've been up to, and I accept it a little bit more. And I know someone else on the panel shared that experience, and I imagine others have gotten some kind of validation out of it being spoken at that level. And one thing I wanted to also share too, in case folks aren't super familiar with the FDA process, phase 1, 2, and 3. If someone is if a site in a clinical trial organization has made it through phase 1, 2, and 3, they've already generated an enormous amount of data. The FDA has already seen that data. The part that's getting sped up is the end of the process after they submit it. So that 10 to 12 month process isn't like, oh, we did one trial and then 2 months later it's ready. There's still a very thorough, very clinically oriented process before that. So just wanted to clarify that in case folks weren't familiar with that part.
I'm glad you did. And on just the topic of public perception shifting, I did a WBTV interview recently in Charlotte about the executive order and like what that means for North Carolina. And I didn't mention it to my family. I mean, I don't really watch cable TV, but my mom does. And so a few days later, she texted me early in the morning and she was like, I just saw you on the Sunday morning news talking about psychedelics. And I mean, she sees me post about it on the internet all the time, but I think it's different when, like, you know, kind of the news source that you go to regularly is now covering the topic.
That's so funny. I love that.
Yeah.
And that also, I mean, and we don't have to segue here yet, but that brings in all the work you do at the state level as well. And I think I interviewed a senator from Arizona a few months back after they passed funding for research in that state. And he was talking about how states really are the incubators of a lot of things that then move forward on the federal level. So is the momentum in North Carolina and some of these other states, is the executive order also kind of riding on the coattails of that a little bit as well?
Yeah, we've seen a few bills come even after the executive order. We introduced one in North Carolina just a couple weeks after. It's called the HEAL Act, SB 1018. It's also bipartisan, and it's kind of a combination of the past two psychedelic bills we've had. So it would create a psychedelic and mental health task force, and then it would also appropriate $5 million towards clinical trials for psychedelics, specifically for veterans, first responders, victims of assault, and frontline healthcare workers. But it does direct the state to look at some of those federal funds coming through that ARPA-H program. You know, we've been garnering just some legislative support about over the past 4 years, and I think that this also just gives people an opportunity to now publicly signal their support. I think especially when we're talking about North Carolina, there's hesitancy, and they really wanted to see the federal government move on something before they did. Because we could, hypothetically, if we created a medical program similar to Colorado or Oregon, it's still federally illegal. We still need these substances to actually be rescheduled, and so there's blocks around that.
That's also really the distinct advantage of our government is set up in a way that there's 50 different experiments that can happen here, right? And we can gather all kinds of data, and we already have. And, you know, speaking of the federal and state thing, you know, the NIH has funded a study of the Oregon psilocybin program. So a federal institution has said, hey, I want to study the federally illegal thing that you're doing. Not only am I not going to come and arrest you, we want to give you money, lots of it, to understand how it's going, right? So this is an interesting signal from the federal side. And also, that's not probably the appropriate strategy for every state, right? And so in North Carolina, SB 1018 is really coming at it from the clinical side. We want to get more data from that. I mean, what are you seeing as some of the primary goals or the outcomes we could expect from 1018?
Yeah, I mean, one is, so we mentioned the clinical trials looking more at safety and efficacy. And I would say for what's relevant to North Carolina, I mean, we have a high veteran population, but we also have a high rural population. And I imagine that we would look at things like substance use disorders as well. Aside from that, what I find to be the most exciting is the task force, which would look at implementation and access, insurance coverage. You know, we could collect so much data, but we want to make sure that it actually translates into the real world, and not just access for a few, but access for many. So how I see this playing out is I think that we could have research being conducted at universities, but we also want to be training people who can actually conduct this treatment in the real world. So I would like to see this task force also advise on how are we implementing, whether that's through some of the like individual clinics, whether that's through hospitals or the VA. I think location is still something to be determined. And we can look at states like Colorado and Oregon. They've been spending years still refining a lot of their regulations around their psychedelic access programs. I don't think we have to totally reinvent the wheel. And I think that's a good place to start.
Can you I just had a follow-up question there because I hear task force thrown around so much, and I know it means a very specific thing, and the task force is doing very specific things. But could you bring in a kind of explanatory comma for me as well as maybe other listeners about what is a task force? Who are you hoping is on it? How does that get selected? And what is this specific task force doing?
So this specific task force would be created through the Department of Health and Human Services within their Division of Mental Health. And essentially what that would do is that it would put a variety of people on there, state legislators, members of HHS, members of the VA, researchers from a couple of institutions, and then also relevant populations. So it outlines just like a broader category of affected populations and organizations that could be on that task force as well. And generally how they're structured is that you have meetings throughout a period of time. It could be a year and a half. You meet regularly, and then you also produce a report at the end. So the group needs to give general consensus on what is in that report. There's quite a few states that have already created and finished their own task forces. So like Maryland, I think Wisconsin as well, Alaska, and there's quite a few others as well. And there's a few reports out there. And generally the goal is to make policy recommendations to give back to our government on what some of those next steps are.
And are those policy recommendations typically adopted for the most part?
I would say in this case, most likely, because we have actual legislators that would be serving on the task force. And so they're the ones that can advise on the policy recommendations and then implement the next steps of those.
Got it. Yeah, very helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And the task force allows us to get more grounded in what's really true, about these medicines and what we know right now, right? I think it's easy to have kind of the anecdotal experience and then just be like, these things should be legal, right? But like, what does that mean, right? What does it mean from a public safety perspective? And so I know that the Maryland task force, they spent at least a year or maybe longer creating a document that summarized the available data and their outline proposed plan. And I've looked at it, and I forget how long. I think it's like 100 pages or something. Like, it's a thorough, long document that they worked on over an extended period of time so that they had the most grounded, practical, and clinical knowledge that they could to outline that plan. From there, they created 3 phases to implement that plan, and then I believe Governor Westmore signed it. So it is a practical and grounded way to implement a long-term plan with data, with a qualified board that have a very diverse set of folks on it. And I believe that's outlined in 1018 as well, to have different people so that there's different expertise to cover the different cultural narratives that happen when we start talking about this process.
And at least 2 members are going to be representing healthcare needs of North Carolina Native communities, which is I was going to actually ask a question about that specifically, but then also this kind of broader question about the indigenous origins of many of these medicines as well, and how is that being considered either at the state level or federal?
Yeah, so I've seen this specifically also in New Mexico and Colorado. I think that they're spending more time on their regulations and processes because of this indigenous and historical component. So I know in Colorado, I think the bill might be going or is on the governor's desk right now, their new Ibogaine bill, and it's because they want to create a profit sharing protocol with where Ibogaine is original from and grown, which is Gabon. Within North Carolina, we did mention having members of tribal communities on there. I think that they've been completely underrepresented in our mental health and psychedelic conversations. I think that most of these conversations will happen within the task force themselves, but there are also members of our legislature who are tribal members, so this is completely relevant. Oklahoma, just a couple of weeks ago, signed a bill with their indigenous tribes. I think it's 5 civilized tribes where they're now authorizing ibogaine clinical trials. And so we're seeing a theme where this conversation is being introduced more. I think that I feel like I say this all the time, which is that I don't want the people who are most effective to just be invited to the table, but to actually be the ones who are actively creating that table. And I think that involves a lot of intentionality to it.
Yeah, and I'm seeing some movement towards an Appalachian Indigenous coalition that can also respond similarly, or I'm in talks with someone who has resources. If you're listening to this and you're in Appalachia or in an Indigenous community, reach out. I'd love to connect you to someone that has resources that help the 5 civilized tribes come to their conclusion on their own, led by their people, led by their leaders. I'd love to share those resources if that's relevant to anyone listening.
Gina, can you say a little bit about just the hype machine? I know in the last few years, there's been so much hype around psychedelics, and there's also been a backlash around it as well, of course, which we've touched on a little bit. But from your position, and especially working as closely as you do with the state legislature, what does it look like on the ground in terms of how are people thinking about this? Are they thinking about this as got to get this through? Also, kind of the position of the veteran voice and hype related to that as well. That's sort of it. I'm just gonna.
I love this question, and my mind has changed on this, but I'll give a little bit of context. So I wrote my master's thesis about how psychedelics are talked about in major newspapers. So I looked at 5 major newspapers, and I looked at themes over a 6-year period of how, like both looking at headlines, but also the text and the different political leanings of those newspapers, taking in consideration what information is being relayed, and essentially, is that more positive leaning, negative leaning, or neutral? And so obviously decades ago, psychedelics were still being used within therapy. Many of them eventually became Schedule 1, and there was all sorts of fear around them. And I feel like people are really actively trying to counteract what happened years and years ago. But I think the hype changes some people's minds, but I think it creates skepticism in others. I would say in many contexts, being, neutral but open is a great idea. But I think that when it comes to something like policy, people are playing a different game and there's a different rule book. And so essentially people are sort of trying to get their idea across the finish line, and they can be creative in how they do that, essentially. I really was just thinking about this yesterday, which is, if you're trying to get someone to act on something maybe they normally wouldn't, being neutral might not persuade them as much as a really positive and compelling story. But it's a slippery slope. I think there are a lot of, well-intentioned people who do want to genuinely share the stories of transformation that they've had, but that can be just really attention grabbing. So on one hand, I'm excited about just all of the developments that we're seeing within this space, but I do think in some ways maybe the media is overpromising what this process actually is. So I'd love to maybe just demystify a little bit of what people are actually experiencing. So in some cases, some people might take a psychedelic once and they feel like, that's good for me. Like, I don't need that experience again. What I feel like I see more often is someone might want to take that treatment every few years. I don't feel like this is magically resolving something for someone. If anything, it's actually giving them more work to do afterwards. So if we use the example of someone who, I actually just met a woman last week who had agoraphobia. She hadn't left her house essentially in 6 years and could barely form a sentence. And she recently went to Mexico to do ibogaine. And I hadn't met her before, but she was vibrant. She was talkative. She obviously was out of her house. I was in Mexico, and that was where I met her. And to me, she showed me a photo. She looked like a completely different person, but it's not like her, issues magically disappeared or went away. If anything, you're going through these treatments and it's showing you maybe what you've neglected to look at over the duration of your life. And that can be really challenging for people, and they might not have been prepared for that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much that needs to be unpacked, right? When we talk about these medicines, their experience, and the potential for it to shift how institutions think about health and healing. Even, so I have went through emotional freedom technique therapy, or also called EFT, and also am implementing it in my own practice. And I thought about, actually this morning, I was thinking about how some medicines are prescribed. It's like really what becomes the efficacy conversation is what it did to an emotion, right? So certain medicines are like may blunt an emotion, right? Some may emphasize an emotion, right? Some may like decrease an emotion. And psychedelics unpack that relationship in a whole different way, right? Where maybe the defensive techniques or the avoidance or habits that one has developed over their lifetime become clearer, that like the reason I have this personality or this way of thinking is actually tied to an emotion that I've been avoiding for a long time, right? And so that's the thing that could be unpacked during or after, right? Which makes the case for me of therapy, no matter how insightful an experience is, to unpack it on your own with no support is very difficult, if not perhaps impossible. And so you need professional support, or you need a really strong community around you that can hold that process and hold it without judgment, right?
That is a really interesting piece of it that I wonder, as this research goes on, where that piece will fit, right? Where that continued follow-up and the integration and the recognition of the many layers of doing this work, how that's going to come in and be held. Do you have any thoughts about that piece of it?
Yeah, I was just seeing a collection of clinical trials recently that was comparing psychedelics, with therapy or psychological support versus without. And it was showing, I would say, if I'm averaging, that people would experience a benefit from a psychedelic without therapy, the benefit would last a few days on average. And then comparing it with therapy, they were seeing benefits last a few months to over a year, which to me is substantial, and speaking exactly to Justin's point, and I'm quoting someone else that I know, that, psychedelics without the therapy is essentially like this cool experience that maybe that you had one time, whereas the therapy is a process which is not just in that moment, but it requires this preparation and integration, which allows you to get the greatest potential benefit from treatment. To your point, Allie, this is a question that I have up in the air, which is that we hear the FDA doesn't regulate therapy, it regulates drugs and medicine. I imagine that psychedelics will go through the FDA approval process, and it may be up to certain states or individuals how they are now authorized to administer that treatment. You and I, and we're all pretty involved in the community, and we know countless therapists who are trained in psychedelic medicine. They already have their own ketamine clinics and practices and trainings in place. I think that it will be standard for a lot of those therapists to insist that the prep and integration come along with the psychedelic therapy. But interestingly, I visited one of the psilocybin centers in Oregon a couple of years ago, and the owner of the clinic told me that the majority of people that they see come in for psilocybin treatment, and they actually never see them again.
Wow, that's pretty striking.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and then, hopefully there'll be some more clear action across all these licensing boards who are currently seeing how ketamine has rolled out, right? Which it has this REMS strategy, the risk evaluation mitigation strategy, where it's allowed there to be what some people call pump and dump clinics, where you just go in, you get ketamine, somebody infuses you, they walk out the room, you sit there for an hour or whatever, and then you even drive home in some cases. And in other cases, that would never be allowed. You don't drive yourself home. You have a therapist before. You do preparation sessions. You get clear on your intentions. You understand what you're about to get into, what could happen. You feel safe. You have a setting around you that allows you to feel safe to access and process some of those emotions that we talked about earlier. It's a whole different setup. Something that you had mentioned, Gina, made me think about essentially like a comparison of the psychedelic experience that is, lasts for a few days and it feels good and maybe you have a large relief, but then without therapy, maybe things start to come back, is a comparison to, in the addiction world, what they call the pink cloud. Right. So when you're in a treatment center and you're around community and, you have rides to the grocery store and you're not around your drug dealer or whatever, and things are looking up, right? And you feel that you're healed. And this happens time and time again in treatment. And so they've developed that term. So you have that experience, you feel healed, and you're like, you know what? I'm good. I feel good. I'm healed. I definitely don't want to go back to that addictive substance, and I'm good, right? And then you get out and people relapse. I've seen it time and time again. People relapse within 24 hours, 48 hours in a big way, right? I've seen people who have, even in my clinical lens, who I've been like, man, this person's like really good. They've like done a lot of hard work here. And then within 48 hours, they're like, I went out and drank, 24 beers and took shots and did some cocaine. And it's like, right? It's kind of the same cross thread of experience, which is you have insight and clarity, right? But without some long-term support that works for you, that's backed by experience, that's evidence-based, that shows, hey, long-term, here's what you're looking at, here's some support that can help you. We're doing a disservice to our fellow humans if we're not setting it up well.
Yeah. Gina, I know we only have you for a few more minutes, and I was going to ask you to share a little bit about Carolinas for Care and all the other things you're up to and how people can stay connected with the important work you're doing.
Yeah, so Carolinas for Care is our new organization that is stemmed off of the North Carolina Psychedelic Policy Coalition, which we formed about 4.5 years ago. And Carolinas for Care is a similar mission, but really dedicated to advancing education, community building, policy, and advocacy around emerging therapies within North and South Carolina. So I don't want to leave our other Carolina behind. And we're really excited to just make this more of a focus. The North Carolina Psychedelic Policy Coalition is something that I had kind of been doing on the side, and I want to adopt Carolinas for Care more into our day-to-day work and advocacy, not just because FDA approval is coming, but that my goal and vision is that we can also continue to do public education around this issue, but also continue to build community. So a lot of people are going through treatments and maybe it's not something that their friends and family understand, and people go out and seek like-minded people who had a similar experience. So I think that we can be a hub for people where they can go to for resources, information, connect with like-minded people, but also be advisors to our state as they're going through their implementation process.
And that is the best way for people to find that is on Instagram, probably, or
we're on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Carolinas for Care, and then also website is carolinasforcare.com.
Yeah, we'll have all those links down in the description as well. Any final thoughts from any of us before we close this out? It's been really enlightening and fun to cover all these topics.
Yeah, I would say, we covered a lot with the executive order, what's to come within North Carolina. I would say, bottom line, I feel like we're kind of policy nerds, so we like to talk about the policies and the recommendations. But the reality is that people are still going to continue to figure this out on their own until they have another option. And to me, this ties into the right to try piece of the executive order, which is something that I hope will move. So essentially, right to try is both a federal and state program where patients can receive investigational new drugs. They haven't yet been approved by the FDA, but they can receive those for life-threatening conditions. In a lot of cases, that is cancer. But with the executive order, it seems like they're also expanding that to life-threatening mental health conditions. Expanding right to try, as I said, was mentioned in the executive order, and it would essentially create an authorization process for physicians to apply to administer Schedule I substances. Essentially, that component is missing. Physicians can work with substances of other schedules, but there just isn't a way for them to work with Schedule I substances right now. So if we prioritize that, I think that's a way that people can receive more immediate access and relief than they have been in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, and without going to the underground or without having to spend $10, $15, $20,000 to make it to a retreat somewhere else. Yeah. And also end of life care, I think, is something in the right to try that has immediate efficacy ready. Yeah.
So fascinating. I learned so much. I feel like we should do another one of these in a few months just to check in on where everything's at. I know I'm going to be watching all the updates and following what you're up to, Gina, and just, yeah, the amazing work that you do. Thank you for all of it.
Thank you, and thank you both. I was thinking the same thing, actually, as we were wrapping up. I was thinking there's probably going to be so much that changes, even just within the next few months, that this might be a very different conversation. So we should definitely do it again.
Yeah. Yeah. Love to. Let's do it. Yeah. All right, y'all. We'll close it out here. Thanks for listening. We'll have all the links in the description. Follow up with all of us and get involved, and let's be the change. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for having me.